just put it, yeah.
Nope, it is going
Oh, it's
live
live.
right
Oh,
now. And so I'm excited to be here with you in conversation. Peter Radunzel, how are you doing right now?
we're doing about as well as you could probably expect given the circumstances. It's tough to be isolated for as long as we have been, but I mean, we definitely recognize the necessity and we're just managing as well as we can.
It feels like that's all we can do. You know,
Exactly.
getting to use Zoom as a technology has given us this insight into people's lives. Are we in your home right now?
Yes, this is what I call my office. It is a small third bedroom where various filings and the computer is, and now that I'm working from home, this is where I work from home. I call it Cranberry because that's where I used to work. So if Aviva comes in here, she usually says, "Hi, I made it to Cranberry," and
I love it.
yes,
I love it. And so we're kind of in my sanctuary slash workout room. The treadmill is
right,
behind us. So we do what we can, right?
exactly. We do what we can. That's all we can do.
So you've been putting some really interesting stuff out there into the world around statistics and the graphic representation thereof. I'm curious first, before we dive in, how did
Mhm.
your interest in some of this develop?
Well, the interest in the pandemic, I mean, my interest in that should be pretty obvious because we're going through it right now. And given that it is a global and national phenomenon where hotspots were appearing everywhere, um, I just wanted to have a means. I was just curious to see like where this is getting hit the most. Um, as far as data in general, it's just something that I've always been interested in. Like my habit of just piling stuff in spreadsheets and compiling them dates from a time when I was a traveling consultant, and I would spend like 3 to 4 evenings every weekend in a hotel room, and many of those nights I would just need something to do, and television is not enough to really keep my mind occupied. So I just started making spreadsheets, and it became something of a habit. If there's data to be processed that is of interest, I will tend to grab it at some point. And with this pandemic happening, the New York Times has been compiling a list of cases and deaths for every county in the country, and they've made it publicly available. So once they started doing that, it's like, aha, how can I use this? And just for my own curiosity, I just wanted to see how various counties were being affected, which ones were getting hot, which ones were getting less than hot. And since I know counties are used to define metropolitan areas and what they call combined statistical areas, I thought it was also a way to see how various regions were being affected that are connected to each other economically. And then, of course, states as a whole. But of course, as seen in Pennsylvania, you got the east side, you got the west side, and they're very different. So, like the overall state rate isn't necessarily going to tell you how various regions are being affected. So, more than anything, I was just curious. I wanted to see how things looked. And, as I went through the data and constructed the Excel spreadsheets, I just was able to find more and more ways to try to delve into it. And the key thing is where the governor has the one big publicly known metric regarding opening up counties from red to yellow to green, et cetera, is number of cases per 100,000 people of population over the course of 14 days. And so having this data lets me and anyone who can assemble it to actually see what those metrics are and in what direction they're going in. And so that has become what is of most interest to me in that particular metric because it's used in Pennsylvania, it's used in Germany apparently too, to determine the viability of opening up our economy, a little bit more than we have been. So,
Sure.
yeah.
So let's dive on in. I'd love to see some of the things you've been working on lately. If you would just kind of give us a
Sure.
tour of some of those things. As I mentioned, I've been seeing some on Facebook and it's
Right.
absolutely fascinating. And so, yeah, if you would just
Oh,
bring us up
share
to
the
speed.
screen.
Yeah.
Yes, we share the screen. Let me know when you can see it.
Looking good.
Okay, so
Screen sharing has started. There we go.
As I mentioned, once the criteria released by the governor of 50 per 100K for 14 days became apparent, that became my prime interest level as far as any sort of geography goes. And this is probably the graph I've shared the most often because certainly up until Friday and even afterwards, this is probably the one that's been of the most interest to the most people, as in the counties in our region, what are they experiencing? And as you can see, I mean, it's can be hard to read because a lot of the it can be hard to distinguish the various colors, especially they're all bunched together. One thing that has been good for our region is that outside of Beaver County, which is this big gray one up here, except for like 5 days in like early to mid-April, we've all been below, all counties in the region, except for Beaver, have been below the 50 rating. Every now and then you see like a little blip, like this was Westmoreland that went up a little bit. There's a weird little gyration in Armstrong County, et cetera. I mean, sometimes you see a little blip or just a variation, probably based upon like data that had been accumulated but not reported yet. But um, basically, the good news for our region is we've been handling this relatively well, except for Beaver County, although most of Beaver County, I believe, is confined to a single nursing home. However, it still means that they're above 50, but I updated this as of the 9th. It looks like Beaver County is going down in the right direction anyway. So I know the officials there weren't unhappy with the decision on Friday, but it seems like things are going in the right direction anyway.
A point of clarification that I just don't know. Do you know where
Yeah,
the number 50 comes from? Why is that the
I do not know.
break-even point for when opening could happen?
Somebody somewhere came up with it, and I guess it just made sense to others. I mean, I didn't know that Germany was using it today. I just read an article today that that was a criteria being used, and it could be Pennsylvania picked it up from there, given that Germany had been dealing with it for a little longer. I don't know. I don't know what's magic about 50, but in the end, you have to pick some metric of some type, and 0 is not something we're going to reach for a while, unfortunately. So, I mean, there are many, many elements that have to be balanced. There's public health, but also human nature and our economy. It's lots of factors go into this, and in the end, you have to pick something to measure as to use as criteria.
Sure.
Yeah.
How does, I'm curious how testing factors in here. One might suspect the
Yes.
more tests, the more positive tests, the more cases, the more Beaver County-esque spikes we're going to see on a graph like this.
Right. Case testing availability and contact tracing ability are components of the criteria used by the state to determine whether or not to move a county from yellow, or from red to yellow and yellow to green. However, there's not like a universal metric. As pointed out 2 weeks ago, when the first batch of counties were announced to be yellow, Allegheny County was specifically pointed out as not being included because of our relatively high population density. So I imagine that factored into just how many tests they'd want to be available. I don't know exactly, what went into it, but I imagine test availability is going to vary by county based upon the characteristics of that county, because Allegheny County is very urban compared to most, and then there's counties like Cameron County or McKean, which are not. And so you can't measure them necessarily by the same criteria,
Right.
depending on what the criteria are.
Fascinating.
And I have to say, I'm not an expert on this, so I mean, what I'm saying is not necessarily golden, but this is my interpretation.
It's a really interesting graph to be able to see
Yes.
that we're doing okay, and perhaps even more importantly, that some of the precautions we've put into place, the social distancing, are truly being effective.
Well, let me show you another graph. Here are the as defined by the government combined statistical areas. Essentially, those are metro areas kind of that are economically connected with each other. So these are like the largest defined metro areas that are essentially usable. these are all the ones that are based in Pennsylvania. Now, since these are metro areas, many of them include counties in other states, like especially Philadelphia, since that spreads into New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland, but also Pittsburgh, because our combined statistical area includes the panhandle, well, the top of the panhandle of West Virginia and one county in Ohio. So this is not just all Pennsylvania, but these are metro areas that are based in Pennsylvania. And as you can see, what I think it's the Lehigh Valley is the largest hump here, and then this is Scranton Wilkes-Barre, which is the second highest. You can see that social distancing and some of the policies put in place have had a tangible effect on the resulting rates. Other places like Philadelphia is kind of plateaued and then hopped up a little bit, and it's kind of struggling to come down. Lancaster is very, 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 it's beginning to come down, but it's, very slow. Then there's Bloomsburg, which is this orange one down here, which goes up nicely and comes down nicely. But what this shows is the effect of policy and human behavior over time. And as we move forward from here, now that some counties are opening up, we'll see if there's any resulting effect from that over the next few weeks. One thing that is intriguing to me here is like there are two little small lines right here, one that went up in a big leap, that's Huntington. There is a prison there where they discovered a large outbreak, and so that sent the rate up quite a lot. And then I don't know why, but what's labeled here is Williamsport, which is Lycoming County, which is Williamsport, and Clinton County, which is Lock Haven. For some reason, they've been consistently going up over the last week or so. So, what this does, it's a day late because the New York Times provides this data, the day after, basically it's complete as of yesterday. It's not like absolutely up to date. I don't think you could do that anyway, but very soon you might be able to see trends that might be a little worrisome. And I don't know what's going on there, but it's interesting, especially since the Williamsport area is in the group of yellow counties. So,
wow. It's interesting to note my hometown, Erie, Pennsylvania, has stayed low.
Oh, yeah.
I presume not because they're doing a much better job than the rest of us at social distancing. Rather, nobody wanted to go there in the first place, and so they have the.
Well, they got the beach. You never know, but that's one thing I noticed about Erie. It never really went up. Of all the regions in the state, especially the populated regions, Erie has never had a high rate at all. Because even though Allegheny, the Pittsburgh area is relatively low now, there was a time that it was rising, but Erie has always had low rates, which is probably why it was among the first group of yellow counties. So Erie is one of those two at the bottom. I don't know which one, but hopefully it stays down. That's the thing. We just want it to stay down, and I just hope it does.
Absolutely. Very cool. All right, what else do you have for us?
See, which one is this? This is state level data. I just picked Pennsylvania and our surrounding states, which would include New York and New Jersey, which are among the two hardest hit states in the country. And as you can see, New York had a very steady rise, crested a little bit, and it's now been coming down at a pretty steady rate, which compared to some other states is actually quite impressive, especially given how bad it was. New Jersey rose at a similar rate, but then has been slower to come down. But there are some states that are consistently increasing, like Maryland here hasn't really had a crest yet. I don't know why, but it's interesting to see just how different states are experiencing this in different ways. This is Delaware, this more squiggly one. It's smaller, which is probably why it's a little less smooth. But as you can see, it's also not quite leveling out. Pennsylvania is the green one down here. So as a state as a whole, we are going in the right direction, just very, very slowly. And I was talking before about counties above or below the 50 mark. As of the 9th, the counties in blue are above it, and the counties, in light blue are below it. So like the counties like York and Adams, like within the last week, managed to dip below that threshold, but at the same time, Clinton and Lycoming County have exceeded it. So I'm afraid that that's going to be the experience of the country as a whole, that as some places go down and recover, other places will just pop up. And that'll just be our experience for a while. That's how things seem to be going as so far anyway.
So at the risk of putting my ignorance out there on the air for all to see, I'm surprised at some of what I would presume to be more rural counties have cases over 50, right? And so we've talked about Beaver County a little bit,
Yeah.
where it's really concentrated, and we know that prisons and elder care facilities are the two kind
Mm-hmm.
of most likely to be hotspots in a county. What's going on in the middle of the state?
Like I said about Huntington County, that is a prison. So that rate is high because there are like 80 or so or more cases found in a correctional facility. And one thing I've found just looking around the country is that almost all hotspots are either prisons or meatpacking plants. And part of that is because typically they're found in lower population areas. That's why you see a lot of counties in Nebraska popping up with high rates, because a lot of those counties are small. And if there's a meatpacking plant in that county, then a high percentage of the population is likely to work there. And if they're found to be, positive, then, as a percentage of the population is going to increase dramatically. And the thing about Clinton County is like 31,000 people. So it was below 50 for a long time, but it doesn't really take too many cases to send it above that. Again, I don't know why, but the fact that Lycoming County has come along with it, and these two counties combined are considered part of the Williamsport, Lock Haven CSA. There might be some sort of correlation. I don't know. Part of it is a function of population, where you don't need that many cases. And if there is a hotspot like a meatpacking plant or other industrial facility, that could send the overall rate for a county going pretty high. Franklin County is also consistently rising. I don't know why. I wish I did. It's considered part of the Washington-Baltimore Consolidated Statistical Area. So in some sense, it's more economically connected to places outside of the state than inside. But I mean, I don't know. I haven't done the research to find out why, but it has been pretty consistent. Whereas York, which is, has a, fairly sizable city in the middle, Adams has Gettysburg, they've been consistently going down, and they've now, below the mark. So like I said, I think it's just, the certain hotspots will rise and fall, usually mostly places like prisons, nursing homes or assisted living centers, and then industrial facilities like meatpacking plants, where a lot of people work in close quarters indoors, essentially for hours.
Interesting. Very cool.
Yes, thank you.
Did I see on your scroll there's one more, or are these the?
Well, this is it. These are
show and tell?
Yeah, these are the four I picked.
Wonderful. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's interesting diving into this and just seeing how things are going, statistically speaking.
Right. So,
Yeah.
So all of the different sources out there, you've chosen the New York Times. Tell me a little bit more about what you know of their data collection processes, or what made that the consistent source you turned to.
Essentially, it was the first one I had heard of, and then I began to investigate it. I compared the case counts they had with what Pennsylvania was reporting, and they were identical. So basically, it's kind of a trust in their research skills and their reporting skills to assemble this data as well as they can. Nothing about the data has ever really contradicted anything I've heard anywhere else. And whenever I do see a hotspot, usually I just go to Google, type in the name of the county, and voila, there's a news report about what was going on there. So it's basically, trust in their reporting ability, but also just validation against other reporting sources, and news reports of actual outbreaks that have been reflected in the data that's been compiled.
Interesting. So one of the questions that you proposed as we were talking about this time together is, why on earth did you get into this in the first place? And I want to couple that with a broader, are there takeaways? Are there things that are giving you hope, or are there interesting things that you're continuing to watch as this goes on that we ought to keep an eye out for as well?
It's both, really. I mean, since the beginning, when I began to actually be able to graph this thing, Pennsylvania's numbers have, even if they've stalled, by and large, they've been going down. So in that sense, I've felt generally good with the experience within the state as a whole. Of course, when I started, is right around April 21st, where most of these lines were coming down, faster, like the top two here, but it's still there. It's a little wobbly, but it's been coming down. But it's interesting at the same time. There's things I didn't know, like Blaine County, Idaho was like one of the earliest hotspots. There's a ski resort there, and apparently people, at least I assume, leaving New York, went there and then started a hotspot there. And then for a while it was New York and New Orleans and Albany, Georgia. And then just looking at this data, I would see these small counties in Tennessee or Arkansas or whatever popping up. And, it was a strong indication that, for one thing, this is not going to go away, and that there's always going to be situations in which this virus can thrive and grab hold. And the fact that prisons, meatpacking plants, there's been a few other industrial facilities, but mostly, I'm sure everyone has heard by now that meatpacking industry has been hit hard. And assisted living centers, basically where large numbers of people have to congregate for hours in an indoor facility, breathing the same air. And this just the way to see where things flare up in a way that you might not otherwise hear, because I don't necessarily keep abreast of prisons in Arkansas, but it also seeing these things pop up and looking at the commonalities. I mean, that can tell you like what trends, what factors contribute to something becoming a hotspot.
Interesting.
But oh yeah, I mean, in the end, I'm not an epidemiologist, and I'm not like a data analyst. So a lot of this is just me reading, talking to people, and I don't do this professionally, so I would not take anything I say just based upon my word as being golden. But at the same time, it's a way to review and analyze and look at the data and just see what commonalities may exist.
Absolutely. And I think you may be being just a bit too modest here. You're doing some localized work that gives us in Southwestern PA a look we wouldn't otherwise get at this type of graphic representation of the data. I'm so appreciative. If someone wants to continue this, if somebody wants to follow and see what else you are putting out, where might they turn?
So as I mentioned to you, the volume of data has gotten so large that I have discovered that it's becoming more and more painful to actually make these things, because Excel sometimes just stops working. It just kills itself, and I have to reopen it up. The amount of processing, the amount of time that it takes to process these things now is like 30 minutes, and that's after I removed a lot of stuff that's not necessary for the graph. So I am beginning to put a lot of the stuff on the web. It's not visualized in the same way, but I do have a website that is more or less ready for viewing. It's not perfect, but there's some errors, but it's probably like 95% accurate, especially after mid-March. So just to try to make it easier so I don't spend an inordinate amount of time wrestling with the limitations of Excel. I can send you the link to it if you're interested. Okay,
Absolutely. I think people would love that, as do I.
good. There's um there's a lot of data out there. There's a lot to be seen, and one thing that I've appreciated from this is as I mentioned, um, these hotspots appearing in Nebraska and Tennessee and Arkansas and all these other places. In some ways, it brings me, it allows me to see just how broad this country is and just how many people are being affected this and just how much this experience is a collective experience by all people in our country and in the world, and that there's no place that can ever be assumed to go free completely. Some places have been luckier than others, like almost all of Montana, but Nebraska in particular right now is experiencing quite a rise. So, we're all affected by this. We're all in this together. And just reviewing this data just lets me see that much more clearly.
Thank you. Thank you for the work and the number crunching you are doing. And thank you for your
Thank you.
time today.
Thank you.